Section 25 of Richelieu by Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8, Literature, Part 3. We can easily imagine that a man like Renaudot, ingenious, intelligent, having travelled and observed much, saw the great advantages which must infallibly result from the regular publication of a newspaper carefully edited and containing reliable details on daily occurrences at home and abroad. Besides, the journal thus conceived and carried out would prove for the government, or rather for the Prime Minister, an admirable help and a means of stopping all the scurrilous pamphlets which were so plentifully distributed. Being issued distinctly cum privilegio, it feared no competition, and no one would dare entering the lists against a journalist who, for aught one knew, might be Richelieu himself. A further circumstance pointed to Renaudot as the natural rédacteur en chef of the projected newspaper. The registrar's office which he had opened was a fertile source of intelligence and gossip, and he had been obliged to set up a printing press, for which ample work would now be regularly provided. On the 30th of May, 1631, a decree was issued by His Majesty granting to Théophraste Renaudot, one of our councillors and physicians in ordinary, master and superintendent of the registrar's office, bureau d'adresse, of the realm, and likewise to his children, descendants, and trustees, the privilege of collecting, printing, editing, and selling wheresoever and by the agency of whomsoever he pleases, the news, gazettes, and narrative of whatever has taken or is at present taking place both within and without the kingdom, interviews, conferences, prices current, etc. The privilege is granted in perpetuity, that is, so long as the aforesaid gazettes, news sheets, and other prints are circulated in France, to the exclusion of all other persons. The first number of the Gazette de France is supposed to have been issued on the same day as the royal edict. It assumed from the beginning a political character. "This is," said Renaudot in its preface, "the journal of the kings and powers of the earth." The discussion of political questions in those days was a dangerous thing, unless the views adopted were in strict accordance with the line prescribed both by the eminence rouge and the eminence grise. But Renaudot had very wisely taken the safe side, and at the end of 2 years' time as a journalist, he was in a position to say to foreign powers that it was no use their endeavouring to prevent intelligence from their respective countries from reaching the office of the Gazette de France. "It is," said he, "a merchandise the trading in which has never been successfully prohibited, and it participates in the nature of a torrent, inasmuch as it merely increases by the resistance offered to it." From historical literature we pass on to tales, novels, and romances, which are in a certain degree branches of the same family, for they are, so to say, photographs of society, and throw much curious light upon the manners, customs, feelings, and aspirations of the day. Mademoiselle de Scudéry's Grand Cyrus was even more than that. 200 years before the author of Waverley had produced his immortal works, it realised the idea of an historical novel, and the laborious researches of the late M. Victor Cousin have proved that the adventures of Cyrus, his battles and his exploits of various kinds, are nothing else but a wonderfully accurate description of the Duc d'Enghien's military career, and of the brilliant successes with which he inaugurated the minority of Louis XIV. From the battlefield of Lens, where the concluding scenes of the 30 Years' War were being enacted, Mademoiselle de Scudéry takes us to the Paris salon and introduces us to the habitués of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. Then it is that she appears as Sappho, and around her we find Cléomire, Madame de Rambouillet herself, the adorable Cléonide, Julie d'Angennes, the beautiful Anacrise, Clarisse her sister, the wonderful Élise, Mademoiselle Paulet, the generous Mégabat, the Duc de Montausier, the illustrious Magus of Sidon, Godeau, Bishop of Grasse, the agreeable Cléarch, Voiture, the wise Théodamas, Conrart, and the admirable Aristée, Chapelain. Ogier de Gombauld, La Calprenède, and Gomberville also contributed their share to the literature of novels and romances. The Endymion of the first of these writers, utterly worthless in point of style, owes its reputation to the fact that, whilst pretending to relate the well-known classical story, Gombauld really expressed his ridiculous passion for the Queen Mary de Medici, then somewhat on the wane, and whose 50 years no artifice could possibly conceal. Having one day to ask a favour of one of the influential personages in attendance upon Cardinal Richelieu, Marin le Roy, Sieur de Gomberville, Thalassius Basilides à Gomberville, as he was fond of styling himself, engaged a street porter for the purpose of carrying a complete set of his works. La Charité, 1621, Polexandre, 1632 1637, La Citerée, 1640 1642, and La Jeune Alcidiane, 1651, were no doubt 2 centuries ago very famous romances, much in request at the Hôtel de Rambouillet. But who has ever heard them even mentioned except Polexandre, which is indebted for its success principally to the circumstance that it describes the relations between France and Spain, and that it deserves to a certain extent a place in the list of historical romances. Gomberville had besides conceived for the conjunction car so intense an aversion that he boasted of not having made use of it once in his 4 volumes, substituting everywhere instead the phrase puisque. It was this singularity which suggested to Voiture the witty letter addressed to Mademoiselle de Rambouillet, in which he took the defence of the threatened conjunction. La Calprenède may be named also amongst the authors of long-winded pseudo-heroic romances. His Cléopâtre and his Cassandre have not even the merit of being well written. The style has neither character nor energy, and the wonder is that to the 7 volumes of his unfinished Pharamond, an enthusiastic continuator should have had the patience to add 5 others. Against these imitations of Spanish literature a reaction was inevitable. The stilted, unnatural, and tedious romances of the Précieux school became so insufferable in their dullness that many attempts were made with much success in a diametrically opposite direction. Charles Sorel's Histoire comique de Francillon is not very edifying, certainly, but it is extremely amusing, and not infrequently makes us think of Le Sage's Gil Blas. Sorel was born for opposition. His Francillon, says M. Colombet, is a kind of Fronde, of which Honoré d'Urfé was the Mazarin. We have had, we quote from the preface, tragic histories enough to sadden us. Let us now have one of a comic kind, and capable of giving pleasure to the gloomiest minds. The Hôtel de Rambouillet, Ménages Mercuriales, Mademoiselle de Scudéry, did not inspire the slightest respect to the clever satirist. He even attacked the heroes of the day, Balzac and Voiture, for whom he had no more esteem than for a couple of fiddlers. By an amusing contrast, the Histoire comique de Francillon was published the same year as the 2nd volume of L'Astrée and as the Citerée of Gomberville. It went through 60 editions in the space of 40 years, and each edition was augmented to a considerable extent by fresh stories which Sorel, or the Sieur du Parc as he pseudonymously styled himself, kept making up as he went on through life, observing the manners, foibles, and ridicules of his fellow Parisians. It is very much to his credit that nothing would induce him to speak of the clergy or of religion, but in terms of the greatest respect. Noblemen, officers, magistrates, literary characters, précieux and précieuses, all the various types of French society crowd his pages and receive his hits, which are dealt with no unsparing hand. The Church alone escapes. If the curés, incumbents, misbehave themselves, he says somewhere, the bishops are at hand to reprove them, It is no business of mine. Théophile de Villot has also published, under the title of Fragments d'une histoire comique, a few chapters which portray real talent, and which, in point of wit, humour, and style, are far superior even to Francillon. Scarron's Roman comique and his Virgile travesti are posterior chronologically, but they belong to the same school, and may be regarded as masterpieces of their kind. In the domains of poetry, when we have named Malherbe's two disciples, Racan and Maynard, there is no author of any merit who really deserves a mention, for a few madrigals, sonnets, bourrimets, and epigrams are not sufficient to immortalize Benserade, Sarrazin, and Godot. This last named rhymester, after having during his youth composed a number of love songs, committed them all to the flames, and set about paraphrasing the psalms and the hymns of the Roman breviary. His version of the Benedicite pleased Richelieu so much that he conferred upon the author the bishopric of Grasse. Vous me donnez Benedicite, said he in his most amiable manner, et je vous donne grâce, grace. The quality of the pun was doubtful, but the gift was not the less acceptable. Chapelain is perhaps the most celebrated of Boileau's victims. The author of L'Art Poétique asks why he would persist in writing poetry. The question might, we think, be modified so far as to express a doubt whether Chapelain should have written at all. The work which has held him up to ridicule is the famous Pucelle, which it took him 5 years to meditate, and which he sketched in prose before writing a single line of it. The first 12 cantos, published in 1656, went through 6 editions in 18 months. But this fit of enthusiasm did not last, and the remaining portion of the epic is still in manuscript. The critic Montmort composed on the poem the following Latin epigram: Illa campellani dudem expectata puella, postanta in lucem tempora prodit annus. Thus rendered into French by Lignières: Nous attendions de Chapelain une pucelle jeune et belle. 20 ans à la forge il perdit son latin, et de sa main il sort enfin une vieille sempiternelle. The want of originality and of vigour which characterises all the productions we have just been naming is equally conspicuous in the dramatic works of Maret and Desmarets. We have already seen Richelieu attempting to establish his reputation as a composer of tragedies. Having neither the time, nor, let us add, the talent, to shine in that direction, he had engaged as his collaborateurs 5 authors, Coltet, Boisrobert, L'Étoile, Rotrou, and Corneille, who constituted what was called La Brigade du Cardinal, or l'Académie de Campagne. To these he dictated his sketches, suggested subjects, and explained his conceptions of character, dialogue, and scenery. The results were very far from satisfactory. In his repertoire of upwards of 500 plays, Garnier had the merit, at any rate, of riveting the interest of the audience by startling episodes which atoned for the wretched meanness of his style. Maret's Sophonisbe, written according to the strictly classical recipe, was a great improvement. Raquin's Bergeries are tediousness itself. Théophile de Villot's Pyrame et Thisbe transferred on the stage the vocabulary of the Précieuses, and, as M. Demegeo wittily remarks, made of the Hôtel de Bourgogne an echo of the Hôtel de Rambouillet. There it is that the famous couplet occurs: Ah, voici le poignard qui du sang de son maître s'est souillé lâchement, il en rougit le traître. It was impossible that all this extravagance should last. The author to whom belongs the merit of having put an end to it was Desmarets. In his play Les Visionnaires he held up to ridicule all the nonsense which passed current at the Hôtel de Rambouillet, and if his descriptions and sketches of character too often strike us as decidedly broad, it may be answered that the puerilities which had so long been accepted as masterpieces of genius deserved not the honour of serious criticism, but merely to be laughed off the stage. We must not grudge a short notice to Alexandre Hardy, Parisien, to quote his favourite designation, a dramatic author absolutely destitute of genius, but who understood the art of writing sensational pieces and amusing the play-going public. For want of originality, he borrowed wherever he could the subjects of his tragi-comedies. History, mythology, Italian and Spanish novels, everything was fish which came to his net, and he was thus able to produce, some say 6, others 800 plays. Out of that large number only 41 have been published, quite enough to give an idea of Hardy's style. We have seen in our own time Alexandre Dumas' Three Musketeers taking 2 soirées in the performance. Alexandre Hardy taxed the patience of his friends for 8 successive nights when his tragedy, Theagenes and Chariclea, was brought out. It is nothing else but the romance of Heliodorus reduced into the shape of a dialogue and acted instead of being read. Our friend M. Desmaugiers reminds us that when this drama was performed, 1601, it was not long since mysteries and miracle plays were acted, all quite as long and almost as tedious. Theagenes and Chariclea might be considered in the light of a secular mystery, and judged according to the same standard. Hardy cared nothing for propriety, style, taste, and correctness. His ars poetica consisted in filling the house. The box-keeper was his Apollo. He could dash off 2,000 lines in 24 hours. It is true that a 5-act tragedy, comedy, or tragicomedy brought him, on an average, 3 crowns. Under such pecuniary difficulties, it would be wrong to find fault with Hardy, either as a thinker or a writer. It is not every one who can afford to be classical at the rate of 5 shillings an act. Only Rotrou and Pierre Corneille remain to be noticed. We have seen that they both belonged to the Académie de Campagne, and it is not difficult to determine the share they had respectively in the dramatic works of the 5 authors. They had sufficient genius, however, to cast away the collaboration even of the cardinal, and there is no doubt that Corneille's impatience of the yoke was the chief cause of the cabal raised against the Cid when that admirable tragedy, or tragi-comedy as it was called, first appeared. The early plays of the author, La Veuve, La Suivante, La Place Royale, La Galerie du Palais, L'Illusion, etc., were composed too decidedly after the prevailing taste to excite the jealousy of other dramatists. But the Cid gave evidence of such superiority that Richelieu's self-love for once took the alarm. He encouraged Scudery and his coterie to run down the new candidate for literary fame, and ordered the Académie Française to write a critique of the play, which was exciting so much attention. Maret and Boisrobert felt bound, of course, to side with their protector, and Chapelain drew up the bill of accusation. But, much to the credit of the academicians, the Sentiment de l'Académie sur le Cid, despite several reservations, proved really a panegyric, and Corneille, encouraged by the enthusiasm with which his tragedy had been received, continued to write for the stage. Horace, Cinna, Polyeucte, Le Menteur, Pompey, all belonged to the reign of Louis XIII. Rotrou was chronologically anterior to Corneille, but as a matter of fact he must be regarded as his disciple, for whereas Le Cid bears the date of 1636, those amongst Rotrou's works which deserve to be mentioned, Saint Genest, Veneslas, Cosroes, were written 10 years later. The difference we find between the compositions of these 2 poets and those of their contemporaries does not reside so much in the source from which they borrowed their subjects as in the treatment of these subjects. Wenceslas and Le Cid, for instance, are taken from the Spanish just as much as Georges de Scudery's Amour tyrannique, but whereas the Précieux dramatists laid the principal stress on a complicated plot and on startling incidents, Rotrou, and especially Corneille, made all the interest derived from the characters themselves and from the struggle between passion and duty. Descartes had accomplished a revolution in philosophy. The author of the Cid brought about one quite as important in dramatic literature. The attention they both excited at first served to prove that they thoroughly understood the intellectual requirements of the age in which they lived, and the high esteem in which they are still held after a lapse of more than 2 centuries shows that their success was not due to fashion and caprice. End of Section 25.